Have you ever noticed how the ones who see the world most clearly are often the ones who feel most out of place in it? There's something paradoxical about deep thinkers. They seek truth, ask hard questions, and push boundaries, not for attention, but because their minds won't allow anything less. And yet, these are often the very people society sidelines, not because they're wrong, but because they make others uncomfortable. Why is that? It begins with a simple truth. Most people don't actually fear being wrong. They fear being made aware of it. When you stand next to someone who is physically gifted, you might admire their strength. If someone is wealthy, you might feel a twinge of envy, but it rarely shakes your core identity. But when you're in the presence of someone who thinks deeper, questions norms, and articulates truths you never considered, it's not just impressive, it's unsettling. Because unlike money or muscles, intelligence doesn't just impress, it exposes. This is what psychologists refer to as cognitive dissonance. When someone introduces an idea that contradicts your beliefs, your brain goes into defense mode. Not because the idea is wrong, but because it threatens your sense of self, your worldview, your mental comfort zone. Deep thinkers, by their nature, disrupt that comfort. They see beneath the surface and aren't afraid to ask, but what if we've got it all backwards? And that question alone can make people feel attacked, even when no attack was intended. The truth is, many people aren't looking for insight, they're looking for affirmation. They want their opinions reflected back at them, not challenged. That's why in many social circles, certainty is valued more than depth. Confidence often outweighs curiosity, and surface-level charm wins out over substance. In fact, studies in social psychology reveal something fascinating. In group settings, individuals who appear too intellectual are often perceived as less relatable, even less trustworthy. Not because they've done anything wrong, but because their presence creates an invisible mirror, one that forces others to see their intellectual blind spots. So, the deep thinker becomes the outsider, not because they choose isolation, but because they carry a spotlight that few want to stand under. But here's the thing, this pattern isn't new. Throughout history, the minds that moved civilization forward were rarely embraced in their own time. Think of Galileo, who was ridiculed for seeing the cosmos differently, or Socrates, who was sentenced to death for asking too many questions. These weren't rebels for rebellion's sake. They simply saw too clearly in a world that preferred the blur of convention. Even today, in an age of endless information, depth is still a threat. Social media rewards speed, simplicity, and outrage. It favors loud voices over thoughtful ones, and as algorithms shape our conversations, those who speak with nuance often struggle to be heard above the noise. So, what happens to the deep thinker? They learn to walk alone. They stop expecting understanding from the crowd. They find comfort in solitude. They learn that loneliness is not always a curse. It can be the space where clarity lives. But this isolation doesn't mean defeat. On the contrary, it is often the quiet path that leads to the most profound discoveries. Because while the world may resist those who think deeply, it is always eventually transformed by them. So if you've ever felt like your thoughts are too heavy for the room, or your questions too disruptive for polite conversation, remember this: you are not broken. You are not alone. You're simply tuned into a frequency that most haven't yet discovered. Keep thinking, keep questioning, because even if the world isn't ready to hear it now, it will be someday.